Big Shaq walked into the small restaurant just like he did most days, hoping to blend in and avoid attention. He wasn't in the mood for the usual crowd of fans or photographers. The world knew him as a celebrity, but today he just wanted a quiet meal. The dimly lit interior of the restaurant seemed like the perfect place to escape from the constant buzz of his fame. As he stepped inside, the warm aroma of freshly cooked food greeted him. He smiled to himself, glad to be away from the chaos. The sound of soft chatter and clinking plates filled the room. He glanced around, hoping to find a corner seat where he could enjoy his meal in peace. A young waiter, who looked no older than 20, noticed him as he walked in. The waiter wasn't paying much attention at first, busy adjusting the menus and wiping down the counter. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Big Shaq's for a brief moment, but his expression quickly turned cold. "Over here," the waiter said, leading him to a small table near the back of the room. The waiter didn't seem impressed by Shaq's presence, nor did he recognize him. He just saw another customer, someone he could serve, someone who could pay him for the meal and leave without making any fuss. He didn't think much about the man sitting in front of him. "Can I get you something to drink?" the waiter asked, flipping open his order pad without so much as a smile. Shaq nodded, feeling a little odd at the lack of recognition. Usually, people were eager to greet him, sometimes even asking for a photo or an autograph. But this waiter didn't seem to care at all. "I'll have some water, thanks," Shaq replied, keeping his tone calm. He didn't want to make a scene, just trying to keep things low. Key. The waiter barely glanced up, scribbling down the order. "Water. Right," he mumbled, turning away without a second thought. Shaq wasn't bothered at first. He had learned to handle moments like these with patience. But as the waiter went on, something about his attitude started to get under Shaq's skin. The young man returned with the water a few minutes later, but he still didn't seem to care about the customer sitting at his table. He plopped the glass down without a word, almost as if he were annoyed by Shaq's presence. The waiter shuffled back to the counter, but not before he made a comment under his breath. "You'd think a guy like that would know how to dress," he said, looking Shaq up and down. His tone was dismissive. Shaq blinked, surprised by the rude remark. He looked at his clothes. Sure, he was dressed casually, a simple t-shirt and jeans, but he didn't think it was anything out of the ordinary. The waiter, however, seemed to think otherwise. Maybe if he spent less time on those silly TV shows and more on his wardrobe, he wouldn't look like he's been living under a rock, the waiter muttered to a co-worker nearby. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he confront the waiter? Should he let it go? He took a deep breath, reminding himself that he didn't come here to cause trouble. He had been looking for a quiet meal, not a fight. But still, the insult stung. The waiter didn't seem to care, going about his business as if nothing had happened. He brought over the menu and placed it in front of Shaq with a slight roll of his eyes, like he was doing Shaq some kind of favor. "Anything else?" the waiter asked, barely masking his sarcasm. Shaq could feel the tension rising. He had experienced plenty of disrespect in his life, but this felt different. He was used to people being nervous or overly eager around him, but this waiter, he didn't care who Big Shaq was. Shaq stared at the menu, deciding not to rise to the bait. The waiter wasn't worth it. But as the meal continued, the insults from the waiter kept coming, each one more cutting than the last. Shaq ordered a dish, and the waiter barely acknowledged it, rolling his eyes as he walked away. "He's probably just here to eat free food," the waiter muttered to another server, loud enough for Shaq to hear. It was then that Shaq realized the waiter had no idea who he was. It wasn't just a small insult, it was a lack of respect for someone he had no clue about. He had been a fan of the restaurant for years, and he could easily have ended the waiter's career with a single word. But instead, he sat there, letting the waiter dig his own grave. Shaq looked at the waiter, still focused on the table, oblivious to the fact that the person he was mocking was, in fact, the owner of the entire restaurant. He didn't know that Big Shaq wasn't just some random guy off the street. Shaq couldn't help but wonder what the waiter would do if he knew the truth. For now, though, Shaq decided to stay quiet. He had learned long ago that sometimes the Best way to handle disrespect was to let it pass. But the little voice in his head couldn't help but wonder just how much longer. Would he be able to keep his cool? The waiter returned to his usual spot behind the counter, glancing over at Big Shaq every now and then. He was convinced that his comments had gone unnoticed. After all, why would a guy like Shaq care about what a simple waiter had to say? The waiter had made his snide remarks, thinking he was in the clear, not realizing he was playing with fire. As he wiped down the counter, the waiter couldn't help but feel a little smug. He'd never had someone come into the restaurant like Shaq, someone who didn't fit into the mold of what he assumed a celebrity should be. Shaq didn't have the flashy clothes, the entourage, or the loud personality. To the waiter, he looked like just another regular guy, a regular guy who, in his mind, deserved a bit of teasing. The restaurant was bustling with customers, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The sounds of forks scraping against plates and the clinking of glasses were all too familiar. But the waiter couldn't shake the feeling that something was different today. There was something about Shaq that bothered him. Maybe it was the way he had so calmly taken the insults, never once raising his voice or giving the waiter a reason to stop. Shaq's quiet demeanor only fueled the waiter's arrogance. Probably doesn't even know how to defend himself, the waiter muttered to himself, feeling more and more confident with every second that passed. He grabbed the order pad again and started walking towards Shaq's table. He wasn't just bringing the food. He had something to say. "Here you go," the waiter said, slamming down the plate with a little more force than necessary. The sound was louder than usual, like a subtle message hidden in the noise. Shaq looked up at him, his face still calm. But something was different now. Shaq's eyes weren't just empty like before. There was something unreadable. The waiter tried not to make it obvious, but a slight chill ran down his spine. He felt like Shaq was silently watching him, as if he could see right through him. But that didn't matter. The waiter had too much pride, and he wasn't going to back down now. "So, everything okay with your meal?" the waiter asked, putting on his most professional smile. Shaq simply nodded. "It's fine, thank you," he said, his voice even and steady. The waiter stood there for a moment, trying to read Shaq's face. Was he being sarcastic? Was this some kind of setup? He had no idea. But he didn't care. He was the one in control. "Now, I just wanted to say, the waiter continued, leaning in slightly. "You don't have to try so hard. I mean, people like you, famous, rich, whatever, you don't need to dress like you're trying to fit in. Just buy something better next time." He let the words hang in the air, as if they held more weight than they really did. For a split second, Shaq's eyes flickered, like he was about to say something. But then he just leaned back in his chair, coolly taking a sip of his water. The waiter turned and walked back to the counter, feeling like he had just won some invisible battle. He couldn't stop smirking as he joined his co-workers, his confidence growing. He was certain now that Shaq, the so-called celebrity, was nothing more than a regular guy with a big name. He was just someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the waiter had no idea how wrong he was. Minutes passed, and the restaurant seemed to get busier, the clatter of plates and chatter of customers filling the space. The waiter went back to his usual routine, checking on other tables and talking to the kitchen staff. But his mind kept returning to Shaq. Why had the man remained so calm? There was something off about him, but the waiter couldn't place it. Maybe it was the way Shaq sat, so still, like he wasn't bothered by anything. Maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to watch everything without saying a word. It didn't matter, though. The waiter had done his part, and now he just wanted to move on. He looked over at Shaq one more time. The man was finishing his meal, taking his time, completely unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing. The waiter felt a strange satisfaction, as if he had gotten away with something. What the waiter didn't know was that Shaq's silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was just the calm before the storm. As the evening wore on, the restaurant became busier. The clattering of silverware and the murmur of conversation blended into a symphony of everyday life. But to the waiter, everything felt distant. His mind kept drifting back to the man at the corner table, Big Shaq. He was still sitting there, quietly finishing his meal. with an air of calm that seemed almost unnerving. The waiter couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about Shaq he just couldn't place. Shaq had barely reacted to any of his jabs. The more the waiter thought about it, the more the situation bothered him. Was this man really as clueless as he seemed, or was he just playing it cool, letting the insults slide? The waiter couldn't decide, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He stood at the counter, watching Shaq from a distance. The man hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound since the waiter's last remark. The calmness, the silence, it all felt so deliberate, like Shaq was a man who knew exactly what was going on, even if he wasn't showing it. The waiter's pride swelled. After all, he was the one in control here. He was the one who had been fearless enough to speak his mind, while Shaq just sat there unaware. Or maybe indifferent. The waiter couldn't resist. He walked back to Shaq's table, his steps deliberate, his confidence growing. Everything all right with your meal, sir? He asked again, a little more pointed this time. Shaq looked up slowly, his gaze steady. The waiter braced himself for a response, maybe a hint of irritation, perhaps even a sarcastic comment, but Shaq just nodded. It's fine. Thank you, he said, his tone as composed as ever. The waiter stood there for a moment, waiting for something more, some sign that his insults had made an impact, but there was nothing. The silence between them stretched, and the waiter couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. Maybe this wasn't as much fun as he had thought. But before he could turn away, the restaurant manager appeared at Shaq's table. He was a middle-aged man with a deep frown on his face, rushing over as if he had just heard some urgent news. The waiter couldn't help but glance over at them, wondering what was going on. Was Shaq causing trouble? Was he going to complain about the service? But then the manager did something unexpected. He bowed slightly, almost in reverence. Good evening, sir, the manager said, his voice filled with respect. I'm so sorry for the delay. Please, allow me to make sure you're taken care of properly. The waiter froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sir? He had no idea what was happening. The manager glanced at the waiter, his expression a mix of surprise and something else, something that the waiter couldn't quite read. Without another word, the manager turned to Shaq. I apologize for the behavior of our staff, the manager continued. We deeply value your presence here, and if there's anything we can do for you, please don't hesitate to let us know. Shaq, who had been sitting there quietly, now stood up, his calm demeanor unbroken. He was about to say something, but the manager quickly cut him off. Mr. Shaq, it's an honor to have you here. Please, if you would, let me personally take care of your bill. The words hit the waiter like a punch to the stomach. Mr. Shaq, the man sitting at the table, the one he had been mocking all this time, was none other than the restaurant's owner. The realization hit him so hard that his legs felt weak. He stared at the two men, trying to process the information, but the words wouldn't come. How had he not known? How had he missed it? He was standing there, fully exposed, like a child, caught stealing candy. Shaq gave the manager a small nod, not acknowledging the waiter's stunned expression. He glanced up at the waiter one last time, his eyes calm, almost unreadable. Without saying a word, Shaq picked up his coat and made his way toward the door. The waiter remained frozen in place, his mind still racing to catch up. The manager turned to the waiter, his face now cold, the warmth gone from his voice. I suggest you learn who's walking into this restaurant next time, the manager said, his words sharp and quiet. This man owns this place, and he's been kind enough to let you keep your job. The waiter stood there, the weight of the situation finally sinking in, his arrogance, his pride, everything he thought he knew crumbled in an instant. It wasn't just a lesson about humility. It was a wake-up call that left him speechless. As the door closed behind Shaq, the restaurant felt quieter than ever. The waiter looked around at the other customers, none of them aware of what had just happened. He swallowed hard, a bitter taste in his mouth. This was a moment he would never forget. The waiter's heart was pounding in his chest as he stood, frozen at the counter, staring at the space where Shaq had been only moments before. The realization that he had insulted the owner of the restaurant was like a heavy weight pressing down on his shoulders. His pride, which had carried him so confidently through the day, had evaporated in the blink of an eye. He tried to keep his composure, but everything felt different now. His hands shook slightly as he wiped down the counter, trying to make sense of the situation. How had he been so blind? Shaq wasn't just another celebrity in disguise. He was the reason this restaurant even existed. Without him, there would be no restaurant. The waiter's stomach churned as the full weight of his mistake sank in. The manager's words echoed in his mind, sharp and unyielding. This man owns this place. The silence in the restaurant felt louder now, like the world was holding its breath. He glanced over at the door where Shaq had exited, wondering if he had truly seen the last of him. Would he come back? Or had this one moment been enough to end the waiter's career? He felt a strange mix of guilt and panic welling up inside him. He had spent his whole life learning how to handle difficult customers, but he'd never had to deal with someone like this. Someone who could ruin him with a single word. As he stood there, wrestling with his thoughts, the manager approached. His face had softened somewhat, but there was no mistaking the disappointment in his eyes. The waiter braced himself for the worst, waiting for the reprimand that was sure to follow. "Look," the manager started, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going to fire you today, but let me make one thing clear. You've got a lot to learn about respect, and you better start learning fast. There are people who can make or break us in this business, and Shaq is one of them. You've got no idea what it's like to work as hard as he does to make a place like this run. So don't you ever make the mistake of thinking you're in control again. Not here, not with people who matter." The waiter opened his mouth to respond, but the words got caught in his throat. He had no defense, nothing to say that could undo what had already been done. He knew the manager was right. He had crossed a line, one that wasn't just about customer service. It was about understanding the power dynamics, the unspoken rules that came with working in a place like this. "I expect better from you," the manager continued. "And so does Shaq. Don't think this slip-up is something that'll just be forgotten. You've got to prove yourself again. And if you ever do something like this again, you won't just be dealing with me. You'll be dealing with Shaq, and I guarantee you that will be a whole different game." The waiter nodded, feeling a deep sense of shame settle over him. He had no excuses. He had messed up, and there was no way to erase it. He had been rude, disrespectful, and careless, and in doing so, he had jeopardized everything he had worked for the rest of the night. The waiter went through the motions of his job like a robot. He took orders, delivered food, and smiled at customers, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a loop of regret. Every time he saw someone walk through the door, he imagined them to be Shaq, ready to call him out, ready to fire him on the spot. It felt like the walls were closing in on him, and he was suffocating in his own mistake. At the end of the shift, the manager called him over. "You've still got a chance," he said, "but don't waste it. I want you here early tomorrow. We're going to go over some things, and you're going to make sure you know how to treat every person who walks through that door." The waiter didn't say anything. He just nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had learned more in a few hours than he had in years of waiting tables. As he left the restaurant that night, he walked out into the cool evening air, the weight of the day still heavy on him. He glanced up at the stars, trying to clear his mind, but all he could think about was the man he had insulted, the man who had the power to destroy him with a single word. And yet, Shaq hadn't. He hadn't said anything, hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply left, but it was the silence that had cut deeper than any insult. The waiter didn't know what to expect when Shaq walked into the restaurant next, but one thing was certain: his next interaction with Shaq would be very different. The next morning, the waiter arrived at the restaurant early, his nerves taut as guitar strings. He had barely slept, his mind running through every scenario, every word, every mistake he had made the night before. The quiet hum of the city outside did nothing to calm him. The weight of what had happened hung over him like a storm cloud, dark and unrelenting. As he walked into the restaurant, the familiar clink of silverware and the sizzling sound from the kitchen greeted him. The staff was already busy preparing for the lunch rush, but the waiter couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Nothing was the same anymore. The manager was already in the office, sorting through some paperwork. He looked up when the waiter entered, his expression serious but not unkind. "Good to see you here early," the manager said, his voice low. "Take a seat, we need to talk." The waiter hesitated but sat down across from him. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest as if it were trying to break free. "I'm sure you've had time to think about what happened," the manager began, "and I hope you've learned something from it. You don't get to treat people however you want in this business, especially not someone like Shaq. You've got to respect your customers, every single one of them." The waiter nodded, his throat tight. He had replayed the moment 1,000 times in his head, each time wishing he could go back and undo his actions. But he couldn't. And now, all he could do was move forward and hope it wasn't too late to fix things. "I get it," the waiter said quietly. "I messed up. I treated him like he was just another customer. But he's not just another customer. He owns the place. I didn't see it then, but I do now." The manager leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're right. But it's not just about recognizing who people are. It's about treating everyone with dignity, whether they're sitting in the corner booth or in a suit. Everyone deserves respect. Shaq may be the owner, but he could just as easily be another person walking through that door. You have to treat him the same way as anyone else, like he matters." The waiter looked down at his hands, the weight of the lesson settling over him. He had been so quick to judge, so sure of himself, but in the blink of an eye, everything had crumbled, and now the only thing left was to rebuild. "That's what I'm going to do," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "I'm going to change how I treat people. I won't make the same mistake again." The manager gave a small nod, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Good. But remember, respect isn't just about the words you say, it's about the actions you take. If you're going to earn back any trust, it's got to show in everything you do." The waiter didn't need any more words. He knew what he had to do. He had to prove himself, not just to the manager or to Shaq, but to himself. As the morning shift began, he stepped into the kitchen, ready to face the consequences of his actions. The restaurant was filling up, customers trickling in, and there he was standing among them, just another worker. But today, he didn't feel small. Today, he felt determined. Every interaction, every customer was a chance to show that he had learned his lesson. And then, just before the lunch rush hit, the door opened. The waiter's heart skipped a beat as he saw Shaq walk in, calm and unassuming as ever. His eyes met the waiter's, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The waiter swallowed hard, his hands suddenly clammy. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was at the test. Shaq didn't say anything at first. He simply walked past the waiter and took a seat in his usual spot. The waiter stood frozen for a second, unsure of what to do. But then, taking a deep breath, he forced himself to walk over to Shaq's table with the kind of quiet confidence he had lacked the night before. "Good afternoon, sir. I'll be your waiter today. May I get you something to drink?" The words were simple, but they carried more weight than ever before. Shaq looked up at him, his expression unreadable. The waiter braced himself for a comment, an insult, anything. But instead, Shaq simply nodded. "Double quotes water, please," he said, his voice calm and steady. It wasn't the grand apology the waiter had imagined in his head. It wasn't a confrontation or a stern word. It was just an ordinary request. But for the waiter, it felt like a second chance, one that he wasn't about to squander. He quickly turned to the counter and filled the glass, his heart still racing. When he returned to the table, he placed the water gently in front of Shaq, making sure not to rush. The waiter didn't try to overdo it with the charm or the unnecessary apologies. He simply treated Shaq like any other guest, respectful, polite, and professional. As the day went on, the waiter's demeanor shifted. Every customer, no matter who they were, got the same attention. The feeling of arrogance he had carried with him the day before had been replaced by humility. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory. Shaq finished his meal and stood up to leave. As he passed by the waiter, he looked at him for a moment, his eyes flicking to his face. "Good job," Shaq said quietly, just loud enough for the waiter to hear, and with that, he left. The waiter stood there, a mixture of relief and pride washing over him. He had done it. He had faced his mistake head on. and he had earned back his dignity, not with words, but with actions. As the door closed behind Shaq, the waiter knew that this moment would stay with him forever. He had learned the most important lesson of all, not just how to serve food, but how to serve people with respect, humility, and the understanding that every person, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated with kindness,